The year is 1975. Boston is cold, gray, and perpetually smelling of salt water and old money and older grudges. Inside a modest apartment in South Boston, a neighborhood locals call Southie, a place of brick row houses and Irish Catholic pride and secrets buried so deep they might as well be part of the bedrock. Two men are sitting across from each other. One is a federal agent of the United States government, a man who carries a badge and a gun and the full authority of the most powerful law enforcement agency on earth. The other is one of the most dangerous men in New England, a man with cold blue eyes the color of January harbor water, a man who does not blink when he kills, a man who has already committed murders that history would not confirm for another 30 years. The federal agent's name is John Connolly. He grew up in this very neighborhood. He grew up watching this other man from a distance, watching the way a young boy watches a dragon, with a mixture of terror and absolute fascination. The other man is James Joseph Bulger, known on every street corner in Boston simply as Whitey. What passes between them in that room on that night will become the single greatest corruption scandal in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What is agreed upon, through words, through handshakes, through gifts and information, and a mutual understanding that some rules exist for other people, will allow Whitey Bulger to murder at will, to extort at scale, to build an empire on blood and bones and bribe silence. For 20 years, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world will not just look away from his crimes. They will actively protect him. They will warn him when investigators get close. They will burn the files of rivals. They will identify informants to him, and those informants will be tortured and killed in basements in South Boston while the FBI runs interference. The 2015 film Black Mass will tell part of this story. Johnny Depp will portray Whitey Bulger and receive enormous praise. But here's the brutal truth that no film has fully captured. The real story was worse. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? I want to know what corner of the world is sitting down for this story tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now. Because what you are about to hear is that Hollywood was not allowed to fully show you, like this video. Share it with someone who thinks they already know the Whitey Bulger story. Because they don't. Not yet. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand James Whitey Bulger, you must first understand South Boston in the 1920s and 1930s. Not the gentrified South Boston of today, with its wine bars and luxury condominiums and young professionals jogging along the waterfront. The South Boston of James Bulger's childhood was a different world entirely. A self-contained Irish-American enclave that operated by its own rules, held its own codes of loyalty and silence, and regarded the outside world with a deep and permanent suspicion. James Joseph Bulger, Jr. was born on September 3, 1929. He was the second of 6 children born to James Bulger Sr. and Jane McCarthy Bulger, Irish Catholic immigrants, who had carved out the most modest of lives in Boston's Dorchester neighborhood before eventually settling into public housing. His father, James Sr., worked as a union laborer and longshoreman, grueling, bone-breaking work, until an industrial accident severed his arm and reduced the family to deeper poverty. The loss of his father's arm was not just a physical tragedy. It was an economic catastrophe. The family's already thin resources became thinner still, and the children grew up understanding that the world was indifferent to suffering, that safety was not guaranteed, and that you had to find your own way to survive. In May 1938, the Mary Ellen McCormick Housing Project opened in South Boston, a cluster of brick buildings on Old Harbor, a name that sounds almost romantic, but which represented in reality the compressed, watchful life of working-class Irish America. The Bulger family moved in. James Jr. grew up there alongside his brothers and sisters. One of those siblings, his younger brother William, would follow an entirely different path, excelling in school, getting elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives by 1960, eventually becoming president of the Massachusetts State Senate, one of the most powerful politicians in the state. Billy Bulger will become the longest-serving Senate president in Massachusetts history. He would hold that position for decades, exercising enormous political influence over the Commonwealth, all while his older brother built a criminal empire in the streets below. The contrast between the two Bulger brothers is one of the most remarkable and troubling subplots in this entire story. They came from the same cramped apartment, the same public housing, the same dinner table. They shared the same blood and the same last name, and yet one would rise through legitimate institutions to achieve extraordinary power, while the other would use murder, extortion, and terror to achieve the same. What separated them was not circumstances. It was choices, and the choices James made were visible from very early on. James, who became known as Whitey, a nickname given him by local police for his shock of platinum blonde hair and fair skin, was drawn to the streets from childhood. He was fearless, physically aggressive, and possessed of a charisma that was less charm than magnetism. He did not seduce people with warmth. He compelled them with presence. The streets of South Boston in the late 1930s and early 1940s were full of young men running in gangs, and Whitey found his tribe quickly. He joined a street gang called the Shamrocks before he was even a teenager, and his appetite for risk was insatiable. His first arrest came at age 14. The charge was larceny, simple theft, but it was merely the first formal acknowledgement of something the neighborhood had already known for some time. Young James Bulger did not care about rules. He cared about power. He cared about what he could take. He cared about whether people feared him. After that first arrest, his record escalated rapidly. Larceny became assault. Assault became armed robbery. He was in and out of juvenile detention, each stint teaching him less about rehabilitation and more about the hierarchy of violence. By the time he was 17, he had developed a reputation on the streets of South Boston as someone you did not challenge. He was not especially large physically, but he was possessed of ferocity that made larger men hesitate. He could turn violence on like flipping a switch, cold, functional, efficient. No rage, no remorse, just action. In 1948, Whitey Bulger joined the United States Air Force. This is one of the stranger chapters of his early life. It reveals something important about how he operated throughout his career. He could inhabit legitimate roles, could present whatever face was required, could function within institutions while planning his exit. He served in the Air Force from 1948 to 1952, but his time in the military was not distinguished service. He was convicted of assault while in uniform. He went AWOL. He served time in military jail. And yet, in one of the many bureaucratic absurdities that would follow Whitey Bulger throughout his life, he received an honorable discharge in 1952 when his service ended. He returned to Boston. He went back to the streets. And now he came back with more discipline, more patience, and a clearer understanding of how organizations worked and how they could be exploited. The next few years saw him escalate from street crime to something more organized and more violent. He became an enforcer, then a planner. He developed skills in surveillance and intimidation. He watched how the existing criminal hierarchy in Boston operated, and he identified its weaknesses. He was not impulsive. Even at this early stage, Whitey Bulger was a student of power. Then he overreached. Between 1950 and 1956, Whitey participated in and led a series of bank robberies across 3 states, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Indiana. These were not petty holdups. They were organized operations, carefully planned, ruthlessly executed. The FBI got involved, and in June 1956, Whitey Bulger was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for bank robbery and truck hijacking. He was 26 years old. He would serve 9 years, and those 9 years would change him in ways that no one in Boston fully understood until it was too late. The federal prison system in the mid-1950s was not designed to rehabilitate. It was designed to contain. And for someone like Whitey Bulger, someone with genuine intelligence, genuine charisma, and a complete absence of conscience, containment was merely an education. Bulger was initially sent to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in Georgia, where he arrived in July 1956. His FBI mugshot from that day shows a young man with sharp, angular features and eyes that give away nothing. He was 26 years old and already possessed of the flat, watchful gaze that would define him for the rest of his life. In Atlanta, he quickly earned a reputation as volatile and dangerous. He was sent to solitary confinement multiple times. He was noted for his readiness to use violence. Because of his behavior, and because he was suspected of plotting an escape from Atlanta, Prison authorities transferred him to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1959. Alcatraz, the Rock, sitting on a wind-swept island in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by waters so cold and currents so treacherous that attempted escapes almost always ended in drowning. Alcatraz was reserved for the most dangerous, most incorrigible federal inmates in America. Its population at any given time included some of the most significant organized crime figures in the country. For Bulger, Alcatraz was, as one biographer later wrote, a front-row seat to the highest stratum of American organized crime. He walked the cell block alongside men who had built criminal empires. He listened and observed and learned. He understood that the criminals who survived and prospered were not the most violent, but the most disciplined, the most patient, the ones who controlled their emotions and directed their violence with surgical precision rather than hot-blooded rage. He also witnessed something in 1962 that entered Alcatraz legend. The famous escape attempt by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, the only breakout from Alcatraz that was never definitively solved. 3 men vanished into the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, and whether they survived or drowned remains one of American criminal history's great mysteries. For Whitey Bulger, watching authorities scramble and admit their failure was likely instructive. Even the most secure institutions had gaps. Even the most powerful system had blind spots. But the most consequential and genuinely disturbing thing that happened to Bulger during his federal imprisonment was not his time at Alcatraz. It was what happened at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, where he was transferred after Alcatraz closed in 1963. At Leavenworth, prison authorities approached inmates with an offer: volunteer for a research program. They said, "It's a pharmaceutical study, testing possible treatments for schizophrenia. In exchange for participation, you can reduce your prison sentence." Whitey Bulger agreed. He was told he would be receiving medication to test its effects on behavior. What he was actually given for 15 months, administered by CIA operatives working to prison, was LSD. This was Project MKUltra. From 1953 to 1967, the Central Intelligence Agency conducted one of the most ethically monstrous covert programs in American government history, a systematic series of experiments designed to explore mind control, behavior modification, and the weaponization of psychological manipulation. MKUltra operatives used unwitting human subjects, prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, civilians, and dosed them with LSD, other hallucinogens, and a range of other experimental substances without consent and without proper medical oversight. The stated goal was to develop techniques for controlling human behavior, potentially for use in interrogation, in warfare, or in covert operations. Whitey Bulger was injected with LSD for 15 months. He had no idea what was really being done to him. He suffered nightmares, insomnia, and episodes of psychological disturbance that, according to those who knew him, never fully left him. Years later, when the truth about MKUltra finally became public knowledge, when congressional investigations and declassified documents exposed the program for what it was, Bulger reportedly became consumed with rage. According to his longtime associate Kevin Weeks, Bulger was so furious about his MKUltra participation that he contemplated tracking down and assassinating the doctor who had administered the LSD to him. This detail, this image of a man who himself tortured and killed people, who himself treated other human beings as mere objects to be used and discarded, becoming consumed with vengeful rage at having been used as an object himself, tells you something deeply important about Whitey Bulger's psychology. He did not see the irony. He was entirely capable of compartmentalization, so complete that his own victimhood occupied a separate moral universe from his predation of others. He was not a hypocrite in the ordinary sense. He was something more clinical, a man for whom the only meaningful moral category was whether things were happening to him or to someone else. After Alcatraz closed, Bulger was transferred to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, and eventually, through a combination of good behavior demonstrations and the efforts of his politically connected brother Billy, his parole petitions were heard. His third petition for parole was granted in 1965. He walked out of federal prison after 9 years, having been sentenced to 25. He was 35 years old. He had been educated by some of the most dangerous men in America. He had been tortured by his own government. He He had returned from those experiences not broken, but sharpened. And he came home to South Boston with a clarity of purpose that was extraordinary in its focus. He was going to build something. He was going to take control. And nothing, not police, not rivals, not even the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, was going to stop him. He just didn't know yet that the FBI would end up helping him. When Whitey Bulger returned to Boston in 1965, the city's criminal underworld was in the middle of a long, bloody reorganization. The preceding decade had seen the Irish gangs of Greater Boston tear each other apart in a series of conflicts collectively known as the Irish Gang Wars, a prolonged, extraordinarily violent series of killings that consumed the McLaughlin and McLean gangs of Charlestown and Somerville, leaving dozens dead and a landscape of organized crime reshuffled. But in South Boston specifically, the war that would define Whitey's ascent was still building. The Killeen gang had controlled the South Boston rackets for 2 decades. They ran bookmaking, loan sharking, and extortion from a base of operations that depended on muscle and reputation. They were the dominant force in Southie. But by the mid-1960s, a rival group had emerged to challenge them. The Mullen Gang, named for the square at the intersection of O Street and East 2nd Street in South Boston, where they congregated. The Mullens were younger, hungrier, and willing to fight. The war between the Killeens and the Mullens was ignited in earnest in 1969, when Kenneth Killeen bit off the nose of Mullen gang member Mickey Dwyer during a bar fight at the Transit Cafe, a Killeen hangout. Biting off a man's nose in front of witnesses is not a gesture that goes unanswered in the criminal underworld, and it did not go unanswered. The Mullens, led by Paulie McGonigal, launched a campaign of shootings and intimidation against the Killeens that turned the streets of South Boston into a war zone. Whitey went to work for Killeen's side, starting from the ground floor, literally. Some accounts suggest initially working as a janitor and construction worker as cover, and working his way up through bookmaking and loan sharking to his natural position, enforcer. He was exactly what the Killeens needed, a man with no hesitation, a man who could look at another human being and make a cold calculation about whether that person needed to be killed. But Whitey also made mistakes. In 1969, he was sent to kill Paulie McGonigal, the Mullen leader. He got the wrong man. He shot Paulie's twin brother Donald McGonigal in the face while Donald was driving Paulie's car. Donald McGonigal was an innocent civilian. He had nothing to do with any gang. He was shot and killed because he looked like his brother from a distance. It was, in the clinical language of criminal investigation, a case of mistaken identity. In human terms, it was the murder of an innocent man. This was Whitey's first confirmed homicide, and it established several patterns that would define his killing for the next 3 decades. The willingness to act on incomplete information, the complete absence of accountability for collateral damage, and the absence of any remorse or acknowledgement of error. The innocent man was dead. The Killeen-Mullen War continued. By the early 1970s, however, Whitey could read the situation clearly. The Killeens were losing. The Mullens had numbers, energy, and tactical advantage. Staying with a losing side was not in Whitey's character. He made a calculation, ruthless, clear-eyed, utterly without sentiment, and switched sides. What happened next depends on which account you accept. Some biographers contend that Whitey himself arranged the killing of Donald Killeen, the Killeen leader, effectively murdering his own boss to smooth his transition to the winning side. Others dispute this. What is not disputed is that on the evening of May 13th, 1972, Donald Killeen received a phone call at his home in Framingham while his family was gathered for his 4-year-old son's birthday party. He told his family he had to step out briefly. He walked outside. He was shot dead. The killing of Killeen effectively ended the Killeen-Mullen War. Whitey emerged from the conflict as a key figure in the Mullen camp, and soon after, a peace summit was arranged at a South End restaurant, mediated by Howard Howie Winter, the head of the Winter Hill Gang base in Somerville. The Killeens and Mullens would end their war. They would consolidate under Winter's leadership. The Winter Hill Gang would be the umbrella organization. And within that organization, Whitey Bulger, the man who had burned his way through a gang war leaving bodies in his wake, would now begin a methodical climb toward the top. The Winter Hill Gang takes its name from the Winter Hill neighborhood in Somerville, Massachusetts, a working-class, predominantly Irish-American area just across the Charles River from Boston. The gang itself predated Whitey's involvement by more than a decade. Under Howie Winter's leadership in the 1970s, it had become the most powerful Irish-American organized crime organization in New England, with tentacles reaching into bookmaking, loan sharking, extortion, horse race fixing, and a partnership with the patriarch of crime family. The Italian Mafia's New England operation based in Providence, Rhode Island. Whitey joined the Winter Hill Gang as a trusted lieutenant after the peace settlement of 1972 to 1973. His South Boston base gave the gang geographic expansion. His reputation for violence gave them a more effective enforcement arm. And his intelligence, his cold, strategic mind, gave Howie Winter something few gang leaders value enough until they no longer have it: sound counsel. But Whitey was never simply a soldier in Howie Winter's army. From the beginning, he was building his own parallel operation within Southie, running the extortion and bookmaking rackets in his home territory with an efficiency and ruthlessness that attracted both admiration and genuine terror from everyone in the criminal ecosystem. He taxed every illegal operation in South Boston. Drug dealers paid him. Bookmakers paid him. Loan sharks paid him. He created a system so comprehensive that running any criminal enterprise in South Boston without his approval became not just difficult, but genuinely dangerous. His method of enforcement was not theatrical. Whitey Bulger did not make speeches. He did not threaten in public spaces. He did not wave guns around in bars. His violence, when it came quietly and completely. Men who refused to pay, or who made the mistake of going to police, or who simply said the wrong thing to the wrong person, disappeared. Or they were found in cars, or face down on beaches. The message needed no amplification. The message was the absence of the man. He also cultivated something that made him unusual among organized crime figures: a public image in South Boston as a protector of the community. This was, in large part, mythology, but mythology carefully maintained and strategically deployed. He was known to help elderly residents with groceries. He was known to discipline local drug dealers who sold to teenagers, presenting himself as a community standard-bearer against hard drug use while simultaneously, as we now know from trial testimony, profiting from drug distribution at the wholesale level. He enforced a code. You could operate a legal business in South Boston, but you paid him, and you did not bring heat, and you did not sell crack to children on his streets. Violate the code, and you face consequences. Follow the code, and you had a powerful patron. This created a situation where large numbers of Southie residents genuinely liked Whitey Bulger, or at minimum gave him the benefit of the doubt. The Irish Catholic community of South Boston had its own relationship with authority, historically adversarial, shaped by generations of political and economic exclusion, and a man who stood up to outside interference while keeping the neighborhood's internal order was not universally seen as a criminal. He was, in many residents' eyes, one of their own, doing what needed to be done in a world where the cops and the courts were not particularly concerned with their welfare. This image was a weapon. It was also, for the families of his victims, an obscenity. His closest associates during the rise of his empire were a carefully selected group of men who shared certain qualities: loyalty, discretion, and no compunction about violence. Stephen, the rifleman, Flemmy, was the most important of these, a figure so central to Whitey's operation that we must spend considerable time with him later in this story. Kevin Weeks was a younger Southie native who became Whitey's most trusted street-level operative, essentially his right hand in the day-to-day management of the rackets and the physical implementation of violence. John Martirano, the executioner, was a hitman of extraordinary prolificacy whose services Whitey used for the killings that required a professional's touch, particularly those conducted outside Boston. In 1979, the architecture of the Winter Hill Gang shifted dramatically. Howie Winter was convicted in a federal horse race fixing case. Ironically, an investigation that Whitey himself escaped because of his already developing relationship with the FBI. The conviction of Winter and several other associates created a power vacuum at the top of the organization. Whitey filled it. He was now the undisputed leader of the Winter Hill Gang. He was the most powerful organized crime figure in South Boston, and he had something that no previous Irish gang leader in Boston had ever possessed: the protection of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. To understand the FBI's role in this story, you need to understand the institutional culture of the Bureau in the 1960s and 1970s, and specifically the culture of the Boston field office. J. Edgar Hoover, who ran the FBI as his personal fiefdom from 1924 until his death in 1972, had a singular obsession in the latter decades of his tenure: the destruction of La Cosa Nostra, the Italian-American Mafia. Hoover had famously and absurdly denied the existence of organized crime for decades, but after the 1957 Appalachian Conference, where New York State Police stumbled onto a meeting of over 60 top Mafia bosses, definitively proving the existence of a national crime organization, Hoover reversed course with enormous institutional energy. The FBI's anti-mafia program became the crown jewel of the Bureau's prosecutorial ambitions. To feed this program, agents cultivated informants within organized crime, and the most prized informants were those closest to the Mafia's inner circle. The Bureau developed a category called top echelon informants, criminal figures so well-placed that their information could be weaponized against entire organizations. These informants were given something that was not officially acknowledged, but was implicitly understood: protection. You inform for us, and we would protect your interests. We would not look too hard at what you were doing. We would warn you about investigations that touched you. We would make you untouchable. This was the logic and the corruption at the heart of what happened in Boston. In 1975, an FBI agent named John Connolly approached Whitey Bulger with a proposition. The approach was not cold. Connolly and Bulger knew each other from Southie. Connolly was about 10 years younger than Whitey, and he had grown up in the same housing projects, had walked the same streets, and had spent his childhood watching Whitey Bulger the way every South Boston boy watched the neighborhood's most feared figure, with a reverence bordering on worship. When Connolly was a young man trying to establish himself, it was reported that Whitey Bulger had done him a favor, intervened in some altercation, perhaps simply acknowledged his existence. That small act of recognition from the neighborhood's dominant predator had lodged itself in Connolly's psyche and never left. John Connolly was born on August 1st, 1940, in South Boston. He was intelligent, ambitious, presentable, a tall man with dark hair and a salesman's ease with people. He joined the FBI and rose steadily, eventually landing in the Boston field office, where he made his mark cultivating informants. He was good at it. He had the South Boston native's ability to code switch between the world of law enforcement and the world of the streets. He could speak both languages, understand both cultures, and leverage that bilingualism to build relationships that other agents could not. When Connolly recruited Whitey Bulger as an informant in 1975, he was theoretically offering the FBI something extraordinary: direct access to the leadership of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish organization with deep connections to the patriarchal Mafia family of New England. In exchange for information about the Italian Mafia, about their operations, their hierarchies, their meetings, Whitey Bulger would receive protection. Protection from prosecution. Protection from rival investigations. Protection, ultimately, from justice. Whitey's reported response to the FBI's offer was perfectly in character. He had spent years publicly despising informants, rats. In the language of the underworld, he had preached the code of silence as a cardinal virtue of criminal life. And yet, when the FBI came to him with an offer that would make him invulnerable, he took it, his reported words. All right, if they want to play checkers, we'll play chess. He did not see it as becoming an informant. He saw it as acquiring an asset. The FBI was a tool. Connolly was a tool. The Bureau's institutional obsession with the Mafia was a tool. He would give them just enough. Names of Italian Mafia figures, tidbits about patriarch operations, details about rivals who were already exposed or disposable, and in exchange you would receive a protective shield that no amount of money could buy. What made this arrangement uniquely, catastrophically corrupt was what happened next. The corruption of John Connolly did not happen overnight. It happened through the slow accretion of favors, gifts, and a psychological dynamic that turned the relationship on its head. Bulger was supposed to be Connolly's asset. Instead, Connolly became Whitey's. The agent began accepting cash and gifts from Bulger. He began actively working to protect Bulger's interests, not just by shielding him from the FBI's own investigations, but by feeding Bulger information about other law enforcement agencies' investigations. State police looking into Winter Hill? Connolly would warn Bulger. DA building a case? Connolly would alert him. Someone cooperating with prosecutors? Connolly would identify the informant. That last category, the identification of informants to a man who used murder as a management tool, has consequences that can only be described as premeditated by proxy. John Connolly did not pull any triggers, but when he told Whitey Bulger that Brian Halloran was talking to the FBI, Brian Halloran died. When he identified Richard Castucci as an informant, Castucci died. Every name Connolly passed had an expiration date the moment it left his lips. Connolly was not alone in his corruption. His supervisor, FBI agent John Morris, also developed a corrupt relationship with Bulger and Flemmi, accepting cash payments and bottles of wine from the Winter Hill leadership. Morris would later testify, having secured an immunity deal, that he had participated in identifying informants to Bulger, that he had been aware of Connolly's gifts and payments, and that the entire informant relationship had become something that bore no resemblance to legitimate law enforcement. The Boston FBI field office had become, in the most critical and accurate sense of the phrase, a criminal organization operating within the Justice Department. Meanwhile, Whitey Bulger was not actually providing significant intelligence about the Mafia. Federal investigators who later reviewed the informant files found that most of the information attributed to Whitey was either already known from other sources or could have been obtained without the extraordinary protections given to him. He was not dismantling the Italian Mafia for the FBI. He was dismantling rival operations that threatened his own empire, then using the FBI's framing to justify the takedowns. The so-called intelligence was often a selective narration designed to use the FBI as a weapon against his enemies, while preserving and expanding his own organization. When the Angiulos, the Gennaro Angiulo operation, the primary Italian Mafia presence in Boston, were eventually brought down through FBI investigation in the 1980s, Connolly and Morris were celebrated within the Bureau. Careers advanced. Awards were given. The Boston office was lauded as a model of aggressive anti-organized crime work. The fact that the Angiulos were brought down while Whitey Bulger committed murder after murder under the FBI's umbrella was not just an institutional failure. It was an institutional achievement, viewed through the perverse logic of the informant program. This is the arrangement. This is the deal. Now, let's look at what it actually enabled. Between 1974 and 1985, James Whitey Bulger participated in at least 19 murders. The jury at his 2013 trial found him guilty of 11. The others were charged but not proven to the jury's satisfaction, or not charged at all. What follows is not a list. These are human beings, men and one woman who had families, who had names, who were reduced to entries in federal indictment by a man who had been rendered legally untouchable by a corrupt government. Paul McGonigal, 1974. Paulie McGonigal was the leader of the Mullen Gang. He was Whitey's rival during the Killeen-Mullen War. He was also, after the peace settlement, technically an ally. Both were now under the Winter Hill umbrella. But Whitey had not forgotten the accidental killing of Paulie's innocent twin brother Donald in 1969. He had not forgotten that Paulie knew it was his mistake, and Paulie had not forgotten his dead brother. In the underworld, a man who blames you for his brother's death is a man who will eventually seek revenge. Paulie McGonigal disappeared in November 1974. His body was unearthed in 2000 from a shallow grave on Tanine Beach in Dorchester, Massachusetts. He had been shot. He had been buried under sand. He had waited 26 years to be found. Edward Connors, 1975. Ed Connors ran a bar. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time and saw something connected to the gang's operations. According to Stephen Flemmi's trial testimony, he and Bulger believed Connors was talking to people about what he'd seen. So they killed him. Connors was shot in a phone booth in 1975. A hail of bullets from a double-barreled shotgun and a handgun, both fired by Bulger, plus 7 or 8 shots from Flemmi. A man died in a phone booth for knowing too much. His death was methodical, planned, and executed without hesitation. Thomas King, 1975. Tommy King was a member of the Mullen Gang, who had made an enemy of Whitey. The specifics of their falling out involved King allegedly expressing his contempt for Whitey to the wrong people. In the criminal world that Bulger controlled, expressing contempt was not safe. King was shot in the back of the head. His body was buried under the Neponset River Bridge in Quincy, Massachusetts. One of several murder victims, Bulger, and his associates buried under the city itself, turning Boston's infrastructure into a system of hidden graves. Richard Castucci, 1976. Richard Castucci owned a nightclub. He was also, unbeknownst to Whitey for a time, an FBI informant, not for Connolly, but for the organized crime unit in the New York office. When Castucci provided information that indirectly helped authorities locate some Winter Hill associates who were hiding from murder charges, Connolly learned about it and passed the information up the chain to Whitey. Castucci was identified as the source. He was lured to a meeting. He was killed. Let that sink in. An FBI agent told a murderer who his fellow law enforcement colleague's informant was. The informant was then murdered. This is not a gray area. This is not a case of competing interpretations. An agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States of America deliberately identified a protected government informant to a man he knew would kill that informant, and that informant was then killed. Roger Wheeler, 1981. Roger Wheeler was a businessman. He owned Telex Corporation, a major technology company, and he also owned World Jai-Alai, a chain of front-ends. Jai-Alai courts with legalized gambling, operating in Florida and Connecticut. What Wheeler did not know when he bought World Jai-Alai was that his management team had a prior relationship with the Winter Hill Gang, and that his company had been providing Whitey Bulger and John Martirano with a steady income stream. Effectively, the organization was skimming money from a gambling operation with the cooperation of company insiders. Wheeler eventually figured out that money was going missing. He started asking questions. He hired a private investigator. He made clear that he intended to get to the bottom of it. Whitey Bulger did not survive by tolerating people who intended to get to the bottom of things. The decision was made to kill Roger Wheeler. On May 27, 1981, Wheeler was playing golf at Southern Hills Country Club in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He walked out to his car after his round. Hitman John Martirano was waiting for him. Martirano approached the car, looked Wheeler in the eye, and shot him once between the eyes. Wheeler died in his car in a country club parking lot in Oklahoma. He had never committed a crime. He had simply purchased the wrong business. Brian Halloran, 1982, and Michael Donahue, an innocent man. Brian Halloran was a Winter Hill associate who had, by 1982, become a liability. He was unstable, and prosecutors had been trying to flip him. Halloran had actually approached the FBI with information. Specifically, he claimed to have knowledge of Whitey Bulger's involvement in the Roger Wheeler murder. He thought giving this information to the FBI would earn him protection. What happened instead was that FBI agent John Morris learned that Halloran was cooperating with a federal investigation. Morris passed this information to John Connolly. Connolly passed it to Whitey Bulger. Halloran had been right to fear for his life. He had told FBI handlers explicitly, if Bulger or his associates found out he was cooperating, they would go to any extreme, even if it meant killing bystanders. The FBI knew this. The FBI had been warned in precise terms that their informant pipeline led directly to murders, and still they passed the information. On May 11, 1982, Brian Halloran left a restaurant in South Boston with a friend, Michael Donahue. Donahue was not a criminal. He was a Teamsters member and neighbor who had offered to give Halloran a ride home. Whitey Bulger and an associate pulled up alongside the car in a vehicle that had been stolen for exactly this purpose. Bulger, wearing a disguise, opened fire with an automatic weapon. Halloran was hit. Donahue, the innocent man, was also hit. Both men died. Michael Donahue's son Tommy would spend the next decades attending every court hearing related to his father's murder. He carried his father's death certificate in his pants pocket every single day of Whitey Bulger's trial. He was there for every word of testimony. His father had been killed by a man firing at someone else, having been warned by the FBI's informant program that his target was there. At Whitey Bulger's trial, evidence was presented showing that Bulger, Flemmy, and their associates were brought into FBI headquarters after the Halloran killing because they were suspects in the Wheeler murder, to pose for photographs to be shared with investigators in Tulsa. In the FBI's own photograph, taken at FBI headquarters, Whitey Bulger is smiling broadly. He is wearing a business suit. He had just killed 2 men on a street in broad daylight. He was standing in an FBI building, smiling protected. John Callahan, 1982. John Callahan was the former president of World Jai-Alai. He was a friend of John Martirano and a financial conduit. between the company and the Winter Hill Gang. He knew about the Wheeler killing. He knew a great deal. When investigators began looking into Wheeler's death and tracing the connections, it became clear to Whitey that Callahan, who was now being pursued by authorities and was potentially vulnerable to prosecution, was a thread that could unravel everything if pulled. The decision was made to eliminate Callahan before he could be made to testify. John Martirano, by his own later testimony, drove to Florida. He and Callahan met. Martirano shot Callahan in the back of the head. Callahan's body was stuffed in the trunk of his own Cadillac and left at Miami International Airport. The message was not subtle. It was not meant to be. John Connolly's role in Callahan's killing would later become central to his own prosecution. Investigators determined that Connolly had passed information to Bulger indicating that Callahan was a weak link, that he might not survive interrogation by federal investigators. This information, prosecutors argued, was the trigger that caused Bulger to order Callahan's elimination. Connolly had warned Bulger. Bulger had ordered the killing. Connolly was convicted of second-degree murder for his role, not for pulling the trigger, but for providing the intelligence that set the murder in motion. Arthur Bucky Barrett, 1983. Arthur Barrett was an alleged jewel thief and bank robber with connections to various criminal enterprises. He had participated in the 1980 Medford Savings Bank robbery, one of the largest in Massachusetts history, and had hidden a significant amount of money from that and other crimes. Whitey Bulger wanted that money. Barrett was lured to a house in South Boston, the basement which had been prepared for this purpose. He was chained to a chair. He was interrogated about where his money was hidden. He told them. Then Whitey Bulger shot him in the head. The sequence is important. Interrogation, extraction of value, then murder. This was not rage killing. This was not impulsive violence. This was the coldly methodical elimination of a human being after extracting what was useful. The chair, the chains, the confession, the bullet. This pattern would repeat. John McIntyre, 1984. John McIntyre was a Quincy fisherman who had made a terrible miscalculation. He was peripherally connected to the Winter Hill orbit. His boat had been used in drug smuggling and weapons-running operations, including, investigators later determined, the shipment of guns and explosives to the Irish Republican Army, a connection Whitey maintained throughout his career. When McIntyre began cooperating with federal authorities, the DEA and Customs, about what he knew of drug trafficking and arms smuggling, word reached Whitey through the usual corrupt channels. McIntyre was brought to a house in South Boston. He was chained to a chair. Whitey interrogated him, asking what he had told authorities who else knew what the investigation looked like. McIntyre told him everything, perhaps hoping that full cooperation would spare his life. It did not. Whitey shot him in the head. His body was buried in the basement. Years later, when investigators finally located the remains, the scene beneath that South Boston basement told the story of at least 2 murders committed in that room. The chairs and the chains and the bodies were all part of a killing system that Whitey had constructed and used systematically, like a piece of infrastructure. Deborah Davis, 1981. Deborah Davis was 26 years old. She was Stephen Fleming's girlfriend. She was, by all accounts, a young woman who had been drawn into an orbit she did not fully understand. The orbit of a man who was simultaneously running a criminal empire and serving as a corrupt FBI informant. In 1981, Fleming made the catastrophic mistake of telling Davis that he and Whitey Bulger were FBI informants. Perhaps he was drunk. Perhaps he was trying to impress her or explain something about his life. Whatever the reason, the information had been shared. And in Whitey's world, information shared was information that could be used against you. Fleming later testified at Whitey's trial about what happened. He said Bulger told him that Davis had to die because of what she knew. Fleming was ordered to bring her to a house. He did so. When they arrived, Whitey was waiting inside. According to Fleming's testimony, the moment Davis walked through the door, Whitey grabbed her by the neck and strangled her while carrying her downstairs. She died in that house. Her body was driven to the banks of the Neponset River in Quincy and buried. 26 years old, Stephen Fleming's girlfriend, killed by the man who was being protected by the FBI. Deborah Hussey, 1985. Deborah Hussey was the stepdaughter of Stephen Fleming. the daughter of Flemy's longtime living girlfriend, Marion Hussey. She had grown up in a household defined by Flemy's presence and by the violence and criminal activity that surrounded him. By the time she was an adult, she was in serious trouble, struggling with drug addiction, getting into legal difficulties, and, under the influence of those difficulties, allegedly beginning to talk loosely about things she knew. Flemmy testified that Bulger decided Deborah needed to die because she was using drugs, getting into trouble with police, and dropping their names when she was in trouble, a dangerous pattern for two men maintaining the fiction that they were legitimate businessmen. Whitey strangled her as well. Her body was buried in another location used for Winter Hill's most permanent problem-solving. The killing of Deborah Hussey adds a dimension to this story that is difficult to look at directly. It is the killing of a young woman who was not a criminal rival, not an informant, not a competitor for territory. She was a damaged young woman who had grown up in proximity to monstrous men and paid with her life for knowing too much about them. By the early 1980s, Whitey Bulger's criminal operation had reached a scale of sophistication and profitability that was remarkable by any standard. FBI financial analysis estimated that he was personally earning between $250,000 and $500,000 per year at the peak of his operation. Figures comparable to senior corporate executives, earned through a combination of extortion, loan sharking, drug distribution, and race-fixing proceeds. His extortion operation was comprehensive. Every bookmaker in South Boston paid him. Every loan shark paid him. Drug dealers operating in his territory paid him a tax, a protection fee that gave him the right to operate without interference from his organization and, crucially, from law enforcement, since his FBI connections gave him advance warning of investigations that he could share with those who paid him. He was not just selling protection from himself. He was selling protection from the entire law enforcement system. That was the product, and it was unique in the American criminal marketplace. His drug operation is worth dwelling on because of the deliberate hypocrisy it represents. Whitey Bulger maintained, for decades, a public position that he was opposed to drug dealing in South Boston. He positioned himself as a community protector who would not tolerate drug trafficking that harmed neighborhood residents. He punished, violently, dealers who sold to teenagers. He used this position to maintain his Robin Hood mythology. And simultaneously, by the testimony of multiple witnesses at his trial, he was taxing drug operations and participating in the distribution chain at a wholesale level. He was not, it is true, selling drugs on street corners. He was something worse. He was the infrastructure that allowed the drug trade to function, collecting tribute from every layer of it while maintaining the fiction of opposition to it. The drug operation that eventually contributed most directly to his legal downfall was tied to the 1984 killing of John McIntyre, the fisherman whose boat was used for what investigators determined was a multi-ton shipment of cannabis from Colombia. McIntyre's cooperation with the DEA and Customs set off the chain of events that led to his murder, and the investigation of that shipment began to illuminate how deeply embedded the Winter Hill Gang was in large-scale drug trafficking. His weapons operation also deserves acknowledgement. Whitey maintained a long-standing relationship with the Irish Republican Army, the paramilitaries fighting British rule in Northern Ireland. This was not ideological commitment. This was business. The Winter Hill Gang supplied weapons to the IRA through a variety of channels, the most infamous of which became the Valhalla operation. In 1984, a 77-foot trawler called the Valhalla set sail from Gloucester, Massachusetts, carrying approximately 7 tons of weapons destined for the IRA. The shipment included machine guns, rifles, handguns, and ammunition. The operation was ultimately intercepted, but its existence demonstrated the international dimension of Whitey's operation and the range of his criminal connections. His lifestyle during this peak period is notable for its deliberate modesty. Unlike John Gotti in New York, the dapper Don, who wore designer suits, ate in famous restaurants, and cultivated celebrity, Whitey Bulger maintained the appearance of a frugal, working-class Southern man. He drove unremarkable cars. He wore ordinary clothes. He lived in modest apartments. He paid for everything in cash. This was not carelessness about money. It was strategic self-preservation. Conspicuous consumption attracted law enforcement attention. Whitey had watched Gotti's flamboyance contribute to his downfall. He chose a different model, invisible prosperity. The wealth estimated at up to $50 million by some investigators, was hidden. Safety deposit boxes in multiple cities, cash-in walls, real estate in the names of associates. And when the time came to run, he had access to enough liquid resources to live comfortably for 16 years without a job. Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi deserves his own extended treatment because his story is not simply Whitey's story. It is, in some ways, a darker story, and that is saying something. Flemmi earned his nickname through his extraordinary proficiency with firearms, cultivated during his time in the Korean War, and refined through decades of criminal service. He was born in 1934 in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood, grew up in the South End, and began his criminal career in the late 1950s as an enforcer and hitman for the Winter Hill Gang's predecessors. He was a decorated Korean War veteran, Purple Heart recipient, a detail that sits uncomfortably alongside the catalog of his crimes. Before Whitey Bulger became an FBI informant, Flemmi was already one. He had been recruited as an FBI informant in the 1960s, working with Paul Rico and Dennis Condon, the agents who ran the Boston office's anti-organized crime program, before Connolly. His status as an informant had already provided him with significant protection from prosecution before Whitey joined the arrangement. The corrupt FBI informant program in Boston did not begin with John Connolly. Connolly inherited and expanded something that already existed. Flemmi and Bulger became partners in the early 1970s, and their collaboration was, by criminal standards, extraordinarily effective. They complemented each other, Whitey providing the strategic direction and the South Boston base, Flemmi providing connections to older Boston criminal networks and his own capacity for violence. Together they built the machinery of the Winter Hill Gang's dominance. But the darkness specific to Flemmi, separate from his partnership with Whitey, concerns the women in his life. Flemmi's trial testimony, given when he cooperated with prosecutors to reduce his sentence, contained revelations about his treatment of Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey that shocked even experienced prosecutors and investigators. Deborah Davis, as described earlier, was Flemmi's girlfriend. She was murdered because she knew too much about the FBI informant relationship. Flemmi brought her to the house where Whitey killed her. He testified that he was instructed to do so, that Whitey made the decision. He did not physically participate in her killing, by his account, but he brought her there. He knew what would happen. Deborah Hussey was worse. She was the daughter of Flemmi's longtime living girlfriend Marion Hussey. Flemmi had known her since she was a young girl. By the time she was an adult, evidence presented at trial indicated that Flemmi had sexually abused her over a period of years, a fact that added yet another dimension of predatory horror to the household that Marion Hussey and her children had been living in. When Deborah's behavior became problematic in the mid-1980s, both Flemmi and Bulger determined she needed to die. Flemmi knew what was coming when he brought her to the location where Whitey strangled her. He testified to watching it happen. The questions surrounding Flemmi's knowledge of and complicity in these women's deaths, and his testimony attributing the primary decision-making to Bulger, were contested vigorously at trial. What is clear is that Flemmi was deeply involved in both deaths and was complicit in what happened to both women, regardless of precisely who gave which order. After his arrest in 1995, Flemmi initially attempted to use his status as an FBI informant to escape prosecution, arguing that his government handlers had given him immunity for crimes committed in his capacity as an informant. This argument was rejected by the courts correctly. Being a corrupt informant does not grant immunity for murder. Flemmi eventually pleaded guilty to 10 murders and cooperated extensively with prosecutors in both the Whitey Bulger case and the cases against corrupt FBI agents. In exchange, he received a life sentence with the possibility of parole, a deal that the families of his victims found, understandably, difficult to accept. Flemmi was one of the prosecution's most important witnesses at Whitey's 2013 trial. He sat in the witness box and described murders, described the killing of women, described the mechanics of the criminal partnership in granular detail. Whitey Bulger sat across from him and maintained an expression of complete contempt. When Flemmi described strangling Deborah Davis, Whitey reportedly shook his head slightly. He never stopped regarding Flemmi as a traitor and never forgave him for cooperating. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, multiple law enforcement agencies were independently building cases against Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang. The Massachusetts State Police, the DEA, the Customs Service, and the Quincy Police Department all had ongoing investigations, and each of them, time and again, found their work being undermined. State Police Lieutenant Colonel Tom Foley ran one of the most persistent anti-Bulger investigations of the 1980s. Years later, after the full scope of the FBI's corruption became public, Foley was forthright about what his unit had experienced. His investigators would develop solid intelligence about Bulger's operations, would build informant networks, would position surveillance, and then the surveillance would be discovered, the informants would be identified, the cases would fall apart. The big job for us was to circumvent the FBI and go after Bulger, Foley said. Every time we shared info, we got compromised. That sentence carries the full weight of what happened. State police investigators understood that sharing information with the FBI was equivalent to sharing it with Whitey Bulger. The federal agency theoretically designed to coordinate anti-organized crime efforts had become a liability. So the state police did something extraordinary. They deliberately withheld information from the FBI. They compartmentalized their investigations, keeping federal agents away from their sources and methods, because they had learned through repeated painful experience that the FBI could not be trusted. In 1988, the Massachusetts State Police placed a listening device, a bug, in a South Boston garage frequented by Whitey Bulger and his associates. The state police operation actually recorded conversations. They gathered genuine intelligence. And then, reportedly, word reached Whitey. The conversation stopped. The useful chatter dried up. The bug had been effectively neutralized by advance warning from inside the law enforcement apparatus. Meanwhile, the DEA was building its own case, focused specifically on the narcotics distribution network that Winter Hill had built. The McIntyre case was part of this, and the Valhalla Arms investigation was another thread. DEA agents knew they were being obstructed. They pursued their cases anyway. The IRS was also involved, tracking the money. Financial investigators are often slower than street investigators, but they are relentless, and money leaves traces even when bodies do not. The financial investigation of Winter Hill's operations throughout the 1980s would eventually contribute to the legal case that was built against Bulger, though Bulger would be gone before it could be brought to trial. Throughout this entire period, John Connolly continued to run his corrupt operation from inside the Boston FBI office. He was not alone. His supervisor, John Morris, was complicit. Other agents may have been complicit to varying degrees. The full scope of the corruption within the Boston field office has never been definitively established, and some investigators believe it was more extensive than the prosecutions that eventually occurred. Morris, having secured an immunity deal in exchange for his testimony, escaped prison despite his admitted participation in the corruption. He retired. He is not in prison. He lives a private life. Many of Bulger's victims' families regard this as one of the most profound injustices in the entire story. The Massachusetts State Police eventually developed a significant case against Whitey in the early 1990s, a drug investigation building on the narcotics threads that the DEA had been pulling. By 1995, federal prosecutors were also ready to move. A federal grand jury in Boston was preparing to hand down an indictment. The case was nearly ready. And then someone told Whitey Bulger, December 1994, Christmas is approaching. Snow is beginning in Boston. And inside the FBI's Boston field office, a decision is being made that will extend the Whitey Bulger saga by 16 years. John Connolly had retired from the FBI in 1990, but his relationship with Whitey Bulger had not ended with his retirement. The corrupt information pipeline that had built over 15 years did not close when he cleaned out his desk. The contacts remained. The loyalties remained. And when word reached Connolly through various channels that federal prosecutors were about to move against Bulger, that an indictment was coming, that arrests were imminent, he passed the information. On January 5, 1995, a federal grand jury issued indictments against Whitey Bulger, Stephen Fleming, and several other Winter Hill associates on charges of racketeering and drug trafficking. When federal agents arrived to execute the arrest warrant, Whitey Bulger was gone. He had left days before. He had taken Catherine Gregg, his longtime companion, and an estimated $800,000 in cash. And he had vanished. He had been warned. He had prepared. And now he was gone. Catherine Gregg deserves attention here. She was not, as some accounts characterize her, simply a passive accessory. She was a Boston woman who had been romantically involved with Whitey since the early 1980s, a dental hygienist who lived with him and knew who he was and what he did. She was also possessed of a loyalty to him that was extraordinary in its depth. When Whitey left, she joined him, not immediately, but within weeks, after receiving word through intermediaries that he wanted her to come. She walked away from her life, her family, her apartment, her twin sisters who were devastated by her disappearance. She chose him. She would spend 16 years as his companion in hiding, providing stability and cover for a man whose face was on wanted posters across the country. They drove. They traveled. They used false identities, purchasing them from transients, acquiring social security numbers from people who had no use for them, building a paper identity thick enough to survive casual scrutiny. They moved through multiple cities and multiple states before eventually settling in what would become their final home. Apartment 303 at the Princess Eugenia Apartments in Santa Monica, California. Santa Monica, the Pacific Coast. Warm weather and morning fog and the enormous, indifferent sprawl of Los Angeles County spreading to the east. Whitey Bulger, America's most wanted gangster, America's second most wanted fugitive after Osama bin Laden, settled into a life of almost aggressive ordinariness. He and Catherine, living under the names Charlie and Carol Gasco, paid their rent, kept to themselves, fed the cats of neighbors, gave small amounts of cash to homeless people in the neighborhood. They shopped at the same stores. They ate at the same restaurants. They walked the same paths. Their neighbors knew them as a quiet, slightly reclusive older couple. Some described Charlie Gasco as friendly in small doses, a man with opinions about sports, who would chat briefly in the parking garage or by the mailboxes and then retreat inside. Nobody suspected. The man from South Boston, the man with 19 murders attributed to him, the man who had been protected by the FBI for 2 decades, was sitting in a beach apartment 3,000 miles away, watching television and feeding stray cats. The FBI, meanwhile, was looking for him. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. He was, for years, the second most wanted fugitive in the country, behind only Osama bin Laden. America's most wanted ran segments on him. His face was on wanted posters. There were tips, sightings across the world, in London, in Italy, in Canada, in various American cities. Investigators followed each one. None led to Santa Monica. The investigation into his whereabouts had its ups and downs. There were periods where it seemed genuinely close to a breakthrough, and periods where it went cold. For 16 years, America's most powerful law enforcement agency could not find a man who was living in a rent-controlled apartment in Southern California under a name that consisted of a first name chosen arbitrarily and a last name that he had purchased from a transit. The gap between Whitey Bulger's notoriety and his invisibility in Santa Monica is itself a study in the limits of surveillance. People know faces from context. The public knew Whitey Bulger as a South Boston gangster, as a younger man with pale eyes and a hard expression in photographs from the 1970s and 1980s. In Santa Monica in the 2000s, he was an elderly man who had aged into someone different in appearance, different in posture, different in the entire physical presentation of his identity. Nobody expects America's most wanted criminal to be their neighbor. People often stop investigating what has already become familiar. While Whitey was living his quiet life in Santa Monica, the infrastructure that had protected him was collapsing spectacularly. The full exposure of the FBI's corrupt informant program in Boston did not happen in a single day. It happened through the accumulated weight of multiple investigations, court hearings, and journalists who refused to stop pulling threads. The Boston Globe Spotlight Team, the same investigative unit that later exposed the Catholic Church's systematic cover-up of clergy's sexual abuse, had been reporting on the Bulger FBI connection since 1988, when they first revealed publicly that Whitey Bulger was an FBI informant. The story that Whitey had lived in terror of being revealed as an informant was in print before he fled. The full scope of the corruption, however, took years more to establish. In the mid-1990s, federal Judge Mark Wolf was presiding over proceedings related to the prosecution of Flemmy and other Winter Hill associates. Proceedings in which Flemy's lawyers raised the extraordinary defense that Flemy had been promised immunity from prosecution by his FBI handlers. Judge Wolf's handling of these proceedings led to something that would become one of the most significant legal developments in the entire story. He ordered the unsealing of thousands of FBI informant records. What those records showed was devastating. The full history of the corrupt informant relationship, the payments, the warnings to Bulger about informants, the FBI's deliberate burial of investigations by other agencies. It was all in the files. It was documented. It was provable. And it was not just Connolly and Morris who had known. The records showed that senior officials within the Boston FBI had been aware of the scope of Bulger's crimes and had permitted the informant relationship to continue regardless. Assistant U.S. Attorney Fred Wishak and FBI Supervisor Charles McGuire conducted the investigation into Connolly's management of Bulger's informant role. What they found, as summarized in subsequent prosecutions, was that most of Whitey's intelligence had been available from other sources, that the relationship had been corrupt from early in its existence, and that Connolly had actively worked to protect Bulger at the direct expense of justice and human life. Connolly was indicted on federal charges in 1999. In 2002, he was convicted of racketeering, obstruction of justice, and lying to an FBI agent, specifically related to his tipping off of Bulger before the 1995 indictment, enabling Bulger's flight. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, but the prosecution was not finished with him. In 2005, Florida prosecutors indicted Connolly for second-degree murder, specifically for his role in the 1982 killing of John Callahan, the World Jaya Lai president whose body had been found in the trunk of his Cadillac at Miami International Airport. The theory of the case was that Connolly had passed information to Bulger indicating that Callahan was a threat, and that this intelligence transmission had directly and proximately caused Callahan's death. The trial was held in Miami in 2008, a quarter century after Callahan's murder. The jury deliberated for less than 3 days. They convicted Connolly of second-degree murder. Judge Stanford Blake, sentencing Connolly to 40 years in prison, said that John Connolly had crossed over to the dark side. John Connolly, FBI agent, proud son of South Boston, childhood admirer of Whitey Bulger, went to prison in Florida for murder. His 40-year sentence was later complicated by appeals and legal proceedings. A Florida appellate court overturned a murder conviction on technical grounds in 2014, related to specific charge and how the jury had been instructed, but Connolly remained incarcerated for years under his original racketeering conviction. He was eventually granted medical release in 2021 due to his deteriorating health. He walked out of prison at 80 years old. John Morris, Connolly's supervisor, who had also taken gift from Bulger and had participated in identifying informants, secured an immunity deal and was never imprisoned. He testified against others and walked free. The families of Bulger's victims regard his freedom as one of the most painful aspects of the entire legal reckoning with the FBI's corruption. 2 other figures in the Winter Hill story turned government witness and provided testimony that shaped the historical record in ways that continue to disturb the families of victims. John Martirano was, by his own admission and by the court's finding, one of the most prolific hired killers in the history of American organized crime. He confessed to committing 20 murders over approximately 2 decades, murders committed for Winter Hill, for the Mafia, and for personal reasons that varied case to case. He was not a reluctant killer. He was a professional who embraced his role, a man who killed people with the workmanlike efficiency of someone performing a specialized trade. When investigators finally caught up with Martirano in 1995 in Boca Raton, Florida, where he had been living quietly after the Bulger operation collapsed, he eventually chose to cooperate. The deal he struck was extraordinary. In exchange for his testimony against Whitey Bulger, Stephen Flemy, John Connolly, and other targets, Martirano received 12 years in prison, approximately 7 months per murder, if you do the arithmetic. He was released in 2004 after serving his time. He was photographed leaving prison and spoke to journalists. He published a memoir titled Hitman, in which he described the murders with matter-of-factness that many found as disturbing as the crimes themselves. The families of Martirano's victims were not consulted about the deal. Their suffering did not factor into the calculation that 12 years was adequate for 20 lives. The families of several victims publicly expressed their devastation at the terms of the arrangement. pointing out that the justice system had effectively put a price on their family members' lives, and that price was approximately 7 months each. Kevin Weeks is a different case. He was Whitey's most trusted street operative, the man who carried out day-to-day tasks for the Winter Hill operation, who helped with murders, who helped bury bodies, and who provided continuous coverage for Whitey's operations in South Boston. He knew where the bodies were buried, both figuratively and literally. When the investigation closed in and cooperation became his best option, Weeks became one of the most valuable informants in the case because he literally knew where the graves were. He directed investigators to the site under a house in South Boston where murder victims were buried. He led them to the Neponset River burial sites. He provided detailed information about the mechanics of Winter Hill murders that gave prosecutors the physical evidence to back up the testimony. He served 5 years in prison, 5 years for years of participation in murders and an empire crime. He also published a memoir titled Brutal, in which he was considerably less contrite than might be expected. Weeks has one passage of testimony that stands out in the historical record. He was asked about the night of an informant killing, the cold mechanics of it, the preparation, the execution. He described it as one professional describing a business process to another. There was no audible remorse. There was no weight. This is what these men were. This is what Whitey Bulger's world produced. Men for whom murder had become administrative. For 16 years, the FBI could not find Whitey Bulger. The hunt cost millions of dollars, utilized the resources of multiple agencies, and generated hundreds of leads that went nowhere. He became, in cultural terms, something almost mythological, a ghost, a man who had vanished so completely that some investigators began to wonder if he was even still alive. He was alive. He was in Santa Monica. The method of his eventual capture was almost anticlimactic after 16 years of global manhunt. By 2011, the FBI had shifted its focus. Rather than pursuing Whitey directly, agents began focusing on Catherine Gregg, reasoning that she was more likely to be traced through patterns of behavior, specifically through her habits around personal grooming and medical care. In the years before their flight, Gregg had regularly received plastic surgery and dental work in the Boston area. The FBI contacted plastic surgery trade publications and dental professional associations across the country, asking for tips about anyone matching Gregg's description and known habits. They also developed updated photographs of what Gregg might look like after years of aging. These photographs were aired on daytime television programs across the country, accompanied by a $2 million reward announcement. The campaign was targeted, focusing on daytime TV programming specifically because the demographic that watched it was most likely to notice a woman matching Gregg's description in their daily neighborhood life. Within a day of those advertisements airing, the FBI's Los Angeles office received a tip. A woman who had been watching the broadcast recognized her neighbor. She called the number on the screen. She described the apartment building. She described the woman and the older man who lived with her. On the evening of June 21st, 2011, FBI agents in the Los Angeles office received the tip and began surveillance of the Princess Eugenia apartments in Santa Monica. The following morning, June 22nd, 2011, the FBI needed to get Whitey out of his apartment and into the open. The building manager was enlisted to call Whitey on a pretext. There was a problem with his storage unit. Could he come down and take a look? Whitey Bulger walked into the building's parking garage. FBI agents were waiting. Special Agent Scott Gorilla confronted him. According to Gorilla, the man initially insisted he was Charlie Gasco. Then, after a moment, a long, flat, assessing pause, he said, "You know who I am. I'm Whitey Bulger." He was 81 years old. He had been one of the most feared men in Boston. He was arrested in a parking garage, standing next to a storage unit, having been lured out on a pretext by a building manager. Inside apartment 303, investigators found 30 guns, including rifles, handguns, and a machine gun. They found $822,000 in cash, much of it hidden in the walls of the apartment. They found knives and ammunition, and they found evidence that he had used safety deposit boxes in multiple cities, Montreal, Dublin, London, Clearwater, Florida, to store additional funds. His estimated net worth before the flight had been approximately $50 million. Even after 16 years of living expenses, he had preserved a substantial portion of it. Catherine Gregg was arrested alongside him. She had spent 16 years choosing him over everything else in her life. She would later plead guilty to conspiracy to harbor a fugitive, conspiracy to commit identity fraud, and identity fraud. She was sentenced to 8 years in a federal prison in Waseca, Minnesota. Her attorney called Bulger the love of her life and said she had no regrets. She would subsequently be indicted on criminal contempt charges for refusing to testify before a grand jury about whether other people had helped them during their years in hiding. She maintained her silence. The trial of James Whitey Bulger opened on June 12, 2013, in the John Joseph Moakley Courthouse in Boston, a modern building on the South Boston waterfront, nearly within sight of neighborhoods where Bulger had built his empire. The building is named for a longtime Massachusetts congressman. The waterfront overlooks was once the domain of longshoremen and fishermen and criminals who understood exactly where the line was between the legal and illegal economies. Jury selection in the case had begun earlier that month. The indictment Bulger faced was massive. A 33-count document that included money laundering, extortion, drug dealing, corrupting law enforcement officials, and participating in 19 murders. The federal racketeering charge alleged that he had run a criminal enterprise from 1972 to 2000. The trial would last 2 months. It would produce some of the most extraordinary courtroom testimony in the history of American organized crime prosecution. It would also produce a single moment that, more than any verdict, defines Whitey Bulger's character as a historical figure. When Whitey was arrested, one of the first things he reportedly said, and one of the few things he would repeat consistently throughout the legal process, was that he was not an FBI informant. His entire life in Southie had been built on the code of silence, on the absolute condemnation of informants. The fact that he had spent 20 years as a top echelon informant, that he had fed names and intelligence to the FBI, that his protection from prosecution had been purchased through exactly the kind of informing he publicly despised. This, apparently, was a thing he could not tolerate being known. Not the murders, not the extortion, not the drug trafficking. Being known as a rat. His attorney, J.W. Carney, opened the trial with a remarkable statement. That Bulger was indeed a criminal, that he had operated a criminal enterprise, but that he was not and had never been an FBI informant. This argument required dismissing the FBI's own files, dismissing the testimony of multiple cooperating witnesses, dismissing the documented history of his corrupt relationship with John Connolly. In short, it required the jury to disbelieve an extraordinary volume of evidence. The prosecution's witnesses were remarkable in their own right. John Martirano took the stand and described murders with the same workmanlike calm he had displayed throughout his cooperation. Matter-of-fact recitations of how he had approached cars, fired guns, disposed of bodies. He described the Roger Wheeler killing in Oklahoma. He described the Callahan killing in Miami. He was specific, detailed, and completely without visible remorse. Stephen Flemmi testified for days. He described murders. He described the killing of Deborah Davis. He described the killing of Deborah Hussey. He implicated Whitey at every turn, directly by name with detail. At one point, Steve Davis, the brother of murder victim Deborah Davis, who had been attending every day of the trial in the seats reserved for victims' families, exploded in rage when Flemmi made a comment suggesting that Davis himself was a drug addict and informant. Davis stood up in the courtroom, shouted across the gallery at Flemmi, and had to be restrained. Flemmi quickly backed off the statement, claiming he had meant a different brother. The outburst captured something essential. The families in that courtroom were not there to watch a legal proceeding. They were there to see the truth spoken about what had been done to people they loved. Kevin Weeks testified about the mechanics of Winter Hill operations, the extortions, the murders, the location of bodies. His testimony about the burial sites and the physical infrastructure of the killing operation provided the kind of documentary evidence that connected court testimony to physical reality. Throughout all of it, Whitey Bulger sat at the defense table with an expression of complete contempt for the proceedings. He occasionally shook his head. He occasionally glared. He conferred with his attorneys in whispers. He did not take the stand in his own defense. He was not going to give the court or the families of his victims the satisfaction of hearing him speak under oath. The jury deliberated for 32 hours over 5 days. On August 12, 2013, they returned their verdict. Guilty of racketeering conspiracy. Guilty of numerous racketeering acts. Guilty of participating in 11 murders. The jury found him responsible for the killings of Deborah Hussey, Paul McGonigal, Edward Connors, Thomas King, Richard Castucci, Roger Wheeler, Brian Halloran, Michael Donahue, John Callahan, Arthur Barrett, and John McIntyre on 7 of the 19 charged murders. The jury did not find sufficient evidence of guilt. On one, they were deadlocked, including the deaths of Deborah Davis and others where the jury did not reach a guilty finding. Not because the evidence was absent, but because the standard of proof in specific charges was not met to every juror's satisfaction. But the verdict also answered the informant question definitively. The evidence presented at trial made unmistakably clear that Whitey Bulger had been an FBI informant. The files were in evidence. The testimony was in the record. Whatever story he told himself, whatever mythology of loyalty he constructed, the jury had heard the truth. The sentence came on November 14, 2013. Judge Denise Casper sentenced Bulger to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. Before the sentence was announced, victims' families were given the opportunity to speak. They called him a terrorist. They called him Satan. They called him a sociopath. Patricia Donahue, whose husband Michael, the innocent man who had offered Brian Halloran a ride, had been shot dead at 40, said she had spent a long time waiting for this day. Steve Davis, Deborah Davis's brother, said he had built up so much hate in his heart over the years that the only relief he could imagine was strangling Bulger himself. He said he hoped Whitey would die the same way his sister had died, gasping for breath. Whitey sat with his back to the families while they testified. He looked at the wall. He did not face them. Whitey Bulger entered the federal prison system in 2013 at the age of 83, serving 2 consecutive life sentences. He was eventually transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, a facility designed for older, medically complex inmates, and then to the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida. He was, by all accounts, frail but still mentally sharp. He received mail. He wrote letters, some of which were later sold at auction by prison officials. He maintained a correspondence with various people, some of them researchers and journalists, some simply people fascinated by his notoriety. Then, in October 2018, someone decided to move him. The reason given, officially, was that Bulger had threatened a prison nurse at Coleman and needed to be transferred as a result. His medical classification was changed, bureaucratically upgraded to indicate relatively good health, a change that made him eligible for placement in a higher security general population facility. He was assigned to USP Hazleton in Brewston Mills, West Virginia, one of the most dangerous federal prisons in the United States. In the 6 months before Bulger's arrival, 2 inmates had already been killed there. The place was known within the Bureau of Prison System as a facility with serious violence problems. On the evening of October 29, 2018, Whitey Bulger, 89 years old, in a wheelchair frail, was rolled into a cell at USP Hazleton. Word of his arrival spread through the prison population almost immediately. An inmate wrote a message to someone he called Mama at 8:33 p.m. that evening, noting that Whitey Bulger had arrived in the yard and would likely be killed. The implication being that his status as a former FBI informant made him a target for anyone who lived by the criminal code he had publicly espoused but privately violated. At 6 a.m. the following morning, October 30th, 2018, the cell doors in Bulger's housing unit unlocked for breakfast. According to surveillance footage reviewed by prosecutors, 3 men met briefly in one cell. Then they walked out together. 2 of them, Foscio's Freddie Hayes and Paul DeCollegiero, entered Whitey Bulger's cell. The third, Sean McKinnon, sat at a table with a clear line of sight to Bulger's cell and the officer's station. He was the lookout. What happened inside Bulger's cell was not quick. Hayes, a former enforcer for the New England Mafia who was serving a life sentence for murder, used a padlock attached to a belt as an improvised weapon. He struck Whitey Bulger in the head, repeatedly. According to prosecutors, there was an attempt to gouge out his eyes, a specific detail that suggests the killing was not just opportunistic violence, but carried the weight of symbolic vengeance. Mob mythology holds that informants are killed in ways that communicate their crime. Blinded, tongue removed, rendered unable to see or speak their betrayals. At 8:07 a.m., a prison guard found Whitey Bulger's body. He was dead. He was 89 years old. He had survived Alcatraz. He had survived the FBI, which had used and protected him for 20 years. He had survived 16 years as a fugitive. He had survived 2 consecutive life sentences. He had been murdered in a federal prison cell less than 12 hours after his arrival. Jack Dawson, a retired Bureau of Prisons official, summarized the institutional response to Bulger's placement at Hazleton with the clarity that the families of his victims had been expecting from institutions for decades. There was a breakdown at every level. What did they think was going to happen? What did they think was going to happen? The question hangs in the air over this entire story. What did anyone think was going to happen? The killing of Whitey Bulger by Focio's Hayes, an Italian Mafia enforcer, is itself a piece of dark historical poetry. Whitey Bulger had spent 20 years as an FBI informant helping to dismantle the New England Italian Mafia. The man who ultimately killed him was a soldier in that same organization, motivated, at least in the mythology of organized crime, by the very code of loyalty that Whitey had publicly championed while secretly violating. In August 2022, Hayes, DeCalagero, and McKinnon were charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Hayes, serving a life sentence already, faced the most serious charges. DeCalagero and McKinnon later pleaded guilty. The legal proceedings around the killing of Whitey Bulger dragged through the court's years after the event itself. Patricia Donahue, whose husband Michael died in 1982 because he offered Brian Halloran a ride, said she was overwhelmed with joy when she heard Bulger was dead. Her son Tommy said he hoped Bulger suffered. Families who had been gasping for justice for 4 decades heard the news and felt something that was not quite satisfaction. Satisfaction would have required justice coming much, much earlier, but was at least the knowledge that the man who had destroyed their families would no longer walk the earth. Steve Davis, Deborah Davis's brother, who had stood up in a courtroom and screamed at Stephen Flemmi, said of Bulger's death, "He died the way I hoped he always was going to die." He had promised his sister that Bulger would face consequences. She had been gasping for breath when she died. Now, perhaps some form of accounting had been made. No examination of Whitey Bulger is complete without extended attention to his brother William Michael Billy Bulger, a figure who represents one of the most uncomfortable questions in the entire story. Billy Bulger served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives beginning in 1960 and in the state Senate from 1970, eventually becoming Senate President, the most powerful position in the Massachusetts legislature, a role he held from 1978 until 1996. He then served as president of the University of Massachusetts until 2003. By any measure, Billy Bulger was one of the most significant and influential politicians in Massachusetts history, a man who shaped legislation, directed patronage, and exercised the kind of political power that ordinary citizens rarely encounter. And his brother was one of the most dangerous criminal figures in the country, operating from the same neighborhood where Billy had built his political base. The question of what Billy knew when he knew it and what he did or did not do about it has never been fully resolved, and it remains one of the most contentious aspects of the entire Bulger legacy. What is documented is this. Billy Bulger maintained a close relationship with his brother Whitey throughout Whitey's criminal career. By his own acknowledgement, he attended Whitey's birthday celebrations. He spoke to him by phone during the fugitive years, a fact confirmed by Whitey's own associates, who testified that Whitey placed calls to his brother while on the run. Billy Bulger, when called before Congress in 2003 to testify about what he knew of Whitey's whereabouts, invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination on multiple questions about his brother. He did eventually testify under limited immunity that he had spoken to Whitey by phone at some point during the fugitive years, but claimed to have no knowledge of Whitey's location. The testimony was deeply unsatisfying to those who had been harmed by Whitey's operation. The suggestion that the president of the Massachusetts Senate had maintained contact with his fugitive brother, a man wanted for 19 murders, and had not assisted law enforcement in locating him, generated enormous political pressure. In 2003, Governor Mitt Romney pressured Billy Bulger to resign from the University of Massachusetts presidency, arguing that his continued refusal to fully cooperate with congressional investigation made his position untenable. Billy Bulger resigned, he was never charged with any crime. He maintains that he had no knowledge of Whitey's specific location during the fugitive years, and that he did nothing to obstruct the investigation. He also maintains with consistency that speaks to either extraordinary compartmentalization or extraordinary self-deception that his relationship with his brother was that of a sibling, that he loved his brother, that family loyalty is not a crime, and that the moral questions raised by his brother's career were Whitey's to answer, not his. The families of Whitey's victims have, largely, a different view. The political career of Billy Bulger and the criminal career of Whitey Bulger were not entirely separate stories. Billy's political power in South Boston was built on the same Irish Catholic community loyalty that protected Whitey's operations. The Bulger name in that community carried weight that was not cleanly separable into the legitimate and the illegitimate. South Boston saw them as both products of the same place, the same people, the same values, one who had gone one way and one who had gone another. The community that gave Billy its votes was also the community that gave Whitey its silence. Whether Billy's political career ever actively served Whitey's criminal career, whether patronage was deployed, whether political influence was exercised to protect his brother's interests, has been alleged by various investigators and journalists and has never been definitively proven in a court of law. What is clear is that South Boston was too small and too interconnected for the two brothers' spheres of influence to have been completely separate, and that the question of complicity cannot be resolved simply by saying that no criminal charges were ever filed. When the full scope of the FBI's corruption in the Bulger case became public, the institutional response was, to put it mildly, inadequate. The Justice Department conducted internal reviews. Reports were written. Findings were issued. The Boston FBI field office's handling of the Bulger informant program was determined to have been one of the worst informant scandals in the Bureau's history, a scandal that cost lives, perverted the course of justice, and demonstrated a systemic failure of oversight and accountability that went far beyond John Connolly and John Morris. Congressional hearings were held. FBI Director Louis Freeh testified. Various current and former agents were questioned. The hearings produced a great deal of language about accountability and reform and the need for better oversight of the informant program. They produced significantly less by way of criminal accountability for the senior officials who had permitted and in some cases enabled the corruption, the specific legal reckoning. Connolly convicted on federal racketeering charges, Morris receiving immunity, various other agents facing administrative but not criminal consequences, left a profound gap between what happened and what justice required. Multiple senior figures who had supervised the corrupt informant program escaped accountability entirely. The institutional culture that had allowed a mob boss to murder freely under the FBI's protection, that culture was addressed in rhetoric and largely left intact in practice. What did change, procedurally, was the oversight framework for top echelon informants. The FBI implemented new requirements for reporting and supervision of informant relationships, new standards for documentation, new rules requiring that supervisors review and approve the actions taken to protect informants. These reforms were real and represented genuine improvement. They did not bring back Brian Halloran or Michael Donahue or Deborah Davis or any of the others. The families of Bulger's victims pursued civil remedies with considerable courage and persistence. Several families filed wrongful death lawsuits against the federal government, arguing that the FBI's deliberate protection of Bulger had caused their family members' deaths, a causal chain that was hard to dispute given the documented history. The federal government settled several of these cases for substantial sums. The Halloran and Donahue families received judgments. The McIntyre family pursued the government and received a settlement. No settlement, of course, approaches justice in any meaningful human sense. Money is not a father who comes to your birthday party. Money is not a sister who grows old with you. The families who filed these suits knew this. They pursued them anyway, because the alternative, allowing the federal government to pay no price at all for participation in murder, was not acceptable. One of the most enduring and most damaging legacies of the Whitey Bulger story is the mythology that surrounded him during his years of power. The Robin Hood narrative, the protector of the neighborhood, the man who kept drugs out of Southie, the voice of Irish-American working-class pride. This mythology was, in large part, a product of Whitey's own careful cultivation. He understood that image was armor, A neighborhood that believed its crime boss was protecting them, would not testify against him, would not cooperate with investigators, would maintain the silence that kept him safe. The stories of his charity, the elderly woman he helped with groceries, the local business he protected, the drug dealer he publicly humiliated for selling to a teenager, were real stories. They just existed alongside a reality of systematic exploitation that was invisible to most of the community experiencing the charity. The drug story is the most revealing example. Whitey made public his contempt for drug dealers who operated in South Boston. He reportedly confronted dealers, threatened them, in some cases used violence against them. This was visible, and it fed the myth. What was not visible, what required years of investigation and trial testimony to document, was that Whitey was simultaneously taking money from drug trafficking operations, that the Winter Hill Gang was deeply embedded in the drug distribution chain, and that his public enforcement of anti-drug norms was selective and strategic rather than principled. The myth served another purpose beyond self-protection. It served as a mirror for the community's own self-image. South Boston in the 1970s and 1980s was a proud, fiercely insular community that had deep grievances against outside interference, particularly around the forced busing desegregation orders of the mid-1970s, which produced violent resistance in Southie that became a national story. In that context, a man who represented South Boston's interests, who stood up to outsiders, who maintained internal order and kept the neighborhood's business in the neighborhood. That man was playing into something powerful and pre-existing in the community's psychology. The reality, as the families of his victims could testify, was something entirely different. Michael Donahue was a South Boston man. He was the very constituent that Whitey claimed to protect. He died in a hail of bullets fired by Whitey Bulger because he happened to be in the wrong car at the wrong time. The families of Bulger's victims were Southie families, Irish Catholic families, families from the same community that maintained the silence protecting him. Their grief and their isolation within that community, unable to speak openly about who destroyed their families, unable to demand justice in a neighborhood where speaking was dangerous, is one of the story's most understated horrors. Over time, and particularly after Bulger's arrest and trial, the mythology has eroded significantly. South Boston itself has changed, gentrified enormously, its demographics shifted, its old working-class Irish community partly dispersed. The mythology of Whitey as protector belongs to a specific moment in South Boston's history that has largely passed. What remains is a documented record. The murders, the extortions, the corruption, the lives destroyed. The 2015 film Black Mass, starring Johnny Depp as Whitey Bulger, captured elements of the story with genuine power. Johnny Depp's performance was widely praised. The pale eyes, the dead-level voice, the physical presence of a man whose violence was entirely interior until it suddenly wasn't. But the film, by the nature of what films can be, was necessarily selective. It could not contain the full scope of what a documentary record contains. It could not reproduce the testimony of victims' families. It could not dwell on the institutional corruption of the FBI for the hours that full understanding requires. It compressed and dramatized and made narrative choices that inevitably simplified what was, in reality, almost incomprehensibly complex. The real story, as this account has attempted to document, was worse than the movie. Not because the movie was dishonest, it largely was not, but because reality has a texture and a scale and a weight that fiction cannot fully carry. The 19 names on the murder indictment are not characters. They were people. The corruption within the FBI was not a plot device. It was a systemic failure that produced real dead bodies. The grief of the families is not a dramatic counterpoint. It is the most important thing in this story. One of the most viscerally disturbing elements of the post-arrest investigation was the discovery of where some of Whitey's victims had been buried. The testimony of Kevin Weeks, who had participated in several burials, led investigators to locations that transformed abstract legal proceedings into something concrete and horrifying. In 2000, federal investigators, acting on the information that Kevin Weeks eventually provided, excavated a site in Dorchester. They found the remains of Paul McGonigal, who had been buried there since 1974. They found other remains at the Neponset River sites. They found evidence of the basement killing locations in South Boston. These discoveries made literal what had previously been known only from testimony. That South Boston itself, the streets and the riverbanks and the vacant lots of the neighborhood, had served as a graveyard for Whitey Bulger's victims. People walked those streets every day. Children played in those neighborhoods. Elderly residents sat on those stoops, while bodies lay a few feet underground. The discovery of the remains was, for the families involved, a complex and profound event. For some, finding a body was the end of decades of not knowing, the cessation of a particular kind of tortured uncertainty. For others, the physical evidence of how their family member had been killed, the forensic details that the discovery necessarily produced, open wounds that had been sealed only by the absence of information. Forensic examination of the recovered remains provided details about cause and manner of death that were sometimes used in legal proceedings and sometimes simply absorbed by families in private. The bodies told stories that Whitey had tried to bury permanently. The stories came out anyway. They always do, eventually. The Whitey Bulger story is not simply the story of a criminal. If it were, it would be less significant. The history of American organized crime is full of brutal men who built brutal empires. What makes this story categorically different? What elevates it from a true crime story to something closer to a study in institutional failure and democratic accountability? Is the FBI? The central lesson is this. The corruption of the Boston FBI field office was not an aberration. It was a product. It was produced by specific institutional incentives. The pressure to develop high-value informants, the metric of Mafia takedowns, the culture of protecting informant sources at almost any cost, combined with the specific human weakness and moral failure of people like John Connolly, who allowed his childhood worship of a neighborhood predator to mutate into complicity in murder. But institutional cultures do not corrupt by accident. The FBI's informant program as it existed in the 1970s and 1980s created the conditions for exactly this kind of corruption. When you tell agents that the ends, Mafia takedowns, prosecutorial victories, justify extensive means, and when you provide insufficient oversight of those means, and when you build a reward structure that celebrates results without examining methods, you create an environment where someone like Connolly can flourish for decades without being stopped. The people who were harmed by this were not abstractions. They were the 19 people on that murder indictment and their families and the communities they left behind. They were the people of South Boston who lived under Whitey's reign of terror, paying tribute to a man who was simultaneously being paid to protect them. They were the other law enforcement officers, the state police investigators, the DA agents, the customs officials, who did their jobs correctly and found themselves obstructed by the very institution they were supposed to be able to trust. The story also asks us to look seriously at the relationship between community mythology and criminal protection. The Southie community that gave Whitey Bulger its silence was not morally pure in that silence, but its complicity was comprehensible, even if not excusable. When institutions designed to protect people instead use them, when police and prosecutors cannot be trusted, when speaking out puts you in danger and keeping quiet keeps you safe, the moral arithmetic of silence becomes more complex than comfortable distance allows. Understanding that complexity is not the same as endorsing the silence. It is simply acknowledging that the structural conditions that sustained Whitey Bulger's power were not reducible to individual moral failure. They were produced by years of institutional corruption, community trauma, political calculation, and the fundamental human tendency to protect what is familiar and fear what is powerful. South Boston today is almost unrecognizable from the neighborhood of Whitey Bulger's reign. The forces of gentrification that began reshaping Boston's neighborhoods in the 1990s and accelerated through the 2000s and 2010s have transformed Southie into one of the most desirable and expensive neighborhoods in the city. The row houses that once housed working-class Irish Catholic families now sell for prices that would have seemed fantastical to the people who raised Whitey Bulger. The public housing projects where the Bulger family lived, where Whitey learned to fight and steal and dominate, have been redeveloped or demolished. The old Southie that gave Whitey his power, the insular, proud, fiercely self-protective community that maintained the silence that kept him safe, has been substantially dispersed. It still exists in fragments in other Boston neighborhoods and in the suburbs where families moved as housing costs rose. But the geography of that community, the concentrated Irish Catholic enclave with its particular codes and loyalties, has been broken apart by economics as thoroughly as it was by Whitey's exposure. Whether this transformation is mourned or celebrated depends on who you ask. Long-time residents who were displaced by rising rents do not always feel grateful for change. The families of Whitey's victims, who had to navigate a community code of silence that protected their loved one's killer, may feel differently. What remains, in any case, is a documentary record, the trial transcripts, the FBI files, some still classified, others unsealed through litigation, the testimony of Kevin Weeks and John Martirano and Stephen Flemmi, the photographs of the guns and the cash found in apartment 303 in Santa Monica, the death certificates that Tommy Donahue carried in his pocket for the length of his father's murderer's trial. Despite the extraordinary volume of information that has emerged through legal proceedings, investigative journalism, and the cooperation of multiple witnesses, significant questions about the Whitey Bulger story remain unanswered. How many more people did he kill? The official count is 19 charged murders, 11 proven to the jury's satisfaction. Multiple investigators who worked on the case over the years believe the actual number is higher. Whitey himself, in conversations during his prison years, neither confirmed nor disputed specific killings beyond what the trial record established. The full body count may never be definitively established. How extensive was the corruption within the Boston FBI field office? John Connolly and John Morris are the agents whose corruption was prosecuted. But the informant files that Judge Wolf ordered unsealed suggested awareness at multiple levels of the office. Connolly operated in an institutional context, with supervisors and colleagues who would have had varying degrees of knowledge about the informant relationship's true character. Some investigators and journalists believe the corruption was more extensive than the prosecutions revealed. The full scope is likely unknown. What did William Bulger know, and when? Billy Bulger's testimony under limited immunity confirmed phone contact with his fugitive brother during the 16-year manhunt. What he knew about his brother's crimes, what information he did or did not share with law enforcement, what political influence was or was not exercised on his brother's behalf. These questions have been asked repeatedly and answered unsatisfactorily. Billy Bulger lives in retirement in Boston. He has not faced criminal charges. He has not, by most assessments, provided a full accounting. Was Bulger's transfer to USP Hazleton deliberately arranged? This question has been raised explicitly by multiple people familiar with the federal prison system's operations. The combination of factors surrounding the transfer, the last-minute change to his medical classification that made him eligible for a higher security placement, the assignment to a prison known for exceptional violence, the arrival in general population rather than protective custody, was described by retired Bureau of Prisons officials as representing a breakdown at every level. Whether that breakdown was negligent or intentional has not been definitively established. And perhaps the most profound unanswered question, how do institutions recover from the kind of corruption that the Boston FBI field office embodied? The procedural reforms that follow the Bulger case are real, but procedures do not repair the moral injury done to the concept of law enforcement by the discovery that federal agents were warning a murderer about investigators and identify informants for execution. The recovery from that kind of institutional damage, if it is even possible, requires something more than new protocols. It requires an honest reckoning with how the culture that produced John Connolly was itself produced. That reckoning, by most assessments, is still incomplete. James Whitey Bulger is dead. He died on October 30th, 2018, in a federal prison cell in West Virginia, beaten to death by a former Mafia hitman, less than 12 hours after his arrival at a facility where everyone, apparently, knew he was coming and everyone knew what was likely to happen. He was 89 years old. He had lived a long life for a man who dealt so consistently in death. He had been protected by the government and by his community, and by his own extraordinary cunning for decades. He had run and hidden and survived for 16 years beyond his natural expiration as a free man. He had sat in a courtroom and heard the truth spoken about him and shown nothing on his face. He had been sentenced to life in prison, and then to another life in prison, and to 5 years beyond that. He had outlived most of his associates, most of his rivals, most of his victims, though not their families, who had survived him with more dignity than he ever showed them. His legacy is a photographic negative of everything he claimed to represent. He claimed to be loyal. He was the FBI's informant. He claimed to protect South Boston. He murdered South Boston residents. He claimed to stand against drugs. He taxed the drug trade. He claimed to honor the dead. He hid them in basements and under bridges. Every public virtue he performed was a mask over a private vice that was worse in every dimension. The institutions that failed, that participated in his crimes, that protected him, that allowed him to operate, bear their own portion of the accounting. The FBI's failure in Boston is documented, prosecuted in part, and still only partially understood. The political culture of Massachusetts that allowed a powerful senator's brother to operate for decades without serious institutional challenge is part of the story. The community's silence that protected him, comprehensible as it was, given the community's relationship with authority, had consequences that fell on innocent people. The film Black Mass showed you some of this. Johnny Depp's portrayal captured the cold blue eyes and the calculated menace. The courtroom scenes captured some of the horror. But film is compression, and this story resists compression. It sprawls across decades and institutions and communities and lives. It demands the full accounting. This is as close to a full accounting as we have been able to assemble. It is almost certainly not complete. There are files still sealed. There are people still living who know more than they have said. There are questions whose answers are buried with the people who could have given them. What we can say with certainty is this. James Joseph Whitey Bulger Jr. was one of the most consequential criminals in American history. Not because his crimes were the worst ever committed on American soil, but because his crimes were enabled by the government sworn to prevent them. The perversion of the FBI's mandate in Boston was not peripheral to his story. It was central. Without the FBI's corrupt protection, Whitey Bulger would have faced justice decades earlier, and the 19 people on that indictment, and possibly others, would have lived. The 19 names deserve to be spoken one more time at the end of this account. Arthur Barrett, John Callahan, Richard Castucci, Edward Connors, Deborah Davis, Michael Donahue, Brian Halloran, Deborah Hussey, Thomas King, Francis Leonard, Paul McGonigal, John McIntyre, Michael Milano, Alfred Noto Rangeli, William O'Brien, James O'Toole, Albert Plummer, James Souza, Roger Wheeler. 19 people. Their names, their lives, their families, their absence still felt. That is the real Black Mass. There is a moment at the end of Whitey Bulger's trial, captured by journalists who were in the courtroom, that encapsulates this entire story more precisely than any single fact or testimony. When the victim's family spoke at sentencing, they faced Whitey Bulger directly. They said what they had needed to say for decades. They called him names that the court reporter dutifully recorded. They described the specific texture of their grief. They did it in public, on the record, in the room where the truth had finally been assembled. Whitey Bulger sat with his back to them. That is who he was. That is the man the FBI protected. That is the man South Boston mythologized. That is a man who smiled in an FBI photograph the day after killing 2 people on a South Boston street. That is the man who ran from justice for 16 years and was finally caught because his girlfriend went to a dentist. That is the man who was beaten to death in a prison cell by a mob hitman because a code he publicly championed and privately violated reached out and found him, finally, at the end. The movie was good. The reality was worse. And the families of 19 murdered people would like you to remember their names. Thank you for sitting through the story with us. If you made it to the end, drop a comment and tell me which part of this story shocked you most. Was it the FBI corruption? The murders? The 16 years in hiding? The end? I want to know. If you found this valuable, share it. This story deserves a wider audience than any Hollywood film has ever given it. Subscribe for more deep dive stories that no film has fully captured. The next video is coming. It is going to be equally dark, equally true, and equally unlike anything you've seen before. These are the stories that matter. Thank you for being here.